Picture this. It's a humid summer evening in 1943. The sun sets over Lisbon, Portugal, painting the Tagus River in shades of gold and crimson. At a cafe on the Rocio Square, a German intelligence officer sips espresso, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. 3 tables away, a British agent pretends to read a newspaper, watching every move. Across the square, an American operative photographs them both from a hotel window. A Soviet informant lingers near the fountain, waiting for a contact who may never come. They all know each other are there. They all know the game, and remarkably, they're all allowed to be there. Welcome to Lisbon during World War II, the most extraordinary espionage capital the world has ever known. A neutral city where enemies dined at the same restaurants, where spy networks from every warring nation operated openly, and where the fate of the war was decided not with bullets, but with whispered conversations and forged documents in smoke-filled rooms. But how did Portugal, a small nation on Europe's western edge, become the beating heart of WW2 intelligence operations? How did neutrality transform a sleepy dictatorship into a battleground where information was the deadliest weapon? And what secrets were passed beneath the sunny facades and cobblestone streets that changed the course of history? In this cipher tale, we decode the remarkable, untold story of how neutral Portugal became the most important spy hub of the Second World War. A place where propaganda masked deception, where double agents thrived in the shadows, and where the line between ally and enemy dissolved into a dangerous gray. This is the story of hotel levies and casino gambling, of coded radio messages and forged passports, of a dictator walking a tightrope between Hitler and Churchill, of refugees and spies who couldn't tell each other apart, of the intelligence operations that made Lisbon more valuable than any battlefield. The game is about to begin. Let's decode it. Why Portugal? The strategic accident. To understand how Portugal became a spy hub, we must first understand why. Geography, dear viewers, is destiny, and Portugal's geography in 1939 made it invaluable to every side of the conflict. Portugal sits at the southwestern corner of Europe, perched on the Atlantic Ocean like a balcony overlooking the world. To its east lies Spain, another neutral nation forming a buffer between Portugal and the Nazi-occupied continent. To its west stretches 3,000 miles of open ocean leading directly to the Americas. To its south, just across the Strait of Gibraltar, sits North Africa, where crucial campaigns would soon rage. But here's what made Portugal truly special: Lisbon's harbor. One of the finest natural ports in Europe, it served as the last major gateway between occupied Europe and the free world. Ships departing Lisbon could reach Britain, the United States, Brazil, or Africa without crossing German-controlled waters. For refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, Lisbon was hope itself, the final train station before freedom. For spies, it was something even more valuable. It was neutral ground. In a world at war where most of Europe had chosen a side or been forced to choose, Portugal remained stubbornly neutral. This wasn't idealism, it was survival. And this single decision transformed the country into something unprecedented. A place where the intelligence services of Germany, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, Italy, Japan, and a dozen other nations could all operate simultaneously. Imagine a chess game where all the pieces from every side are placed on the same board, moving around each other, and you begin to grasp the situation. Salazar's tightrope, the dictator who said no to everyone. At the center of this neutrality stood one man, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, Portugal's authoritarian prime minister. Salazar was a former economics professor who had transformed Portugal into a conservative dictatorship called the Estado Novo, the new state. He was deeply religious, deeply anti-communist, and deeply obsessed with keeping Portugal out of the war. Salazar's position was precarious. Portugal had a centuries-old alliance with Britain, the oldest alliance in the world, dating back to 1386. Britain expected Portuguese support, or at least cooperation. But Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe by 1940, and Hitler could crush Portugal whenever he wished. Spain's dictator Francisco Franco, who had just won a civil war with German and Italian help, sat on Portugal's border. One wrong move and Portugal could be invaded from the east or bombed from the north, so Salazar played both sides masterfully. To Britain, He emphasized the ancient alliance and quietly allowed the British to use Azores Islands as naval bases later in the war. To Germany, he sold tungsten, a metal critical for armor-piercing ammunition and jet engines, and allowed German agents to operate in Lisbon. He maintained diplomatic relations with everyone, censored his press to avoid offending anyone, and walked a tightrope that would have destroyed a lesser politician. But here's the secret Salazar understood. By remaining neutral, Portugal became indispensable to all sides, and by allowing spies to operate he gained leverage. Information flowed through Lisbon, and Salazar's intelligence services, the PVDE, Polícia de Vigilância e Defesa do Estado, watched everyone collecting their own dossiers, playing their own game. One Portuguese intelligence officer reportedly said, "We don't choose sides. We collect sides." This calculated neutrality created the perfect environment for espionage. Spies need places to meet contacts, to pass information, to communicate with their home countries. They need hotels and cafes and nightclubs where conversations can be overheard or privacy can be bought. They need postal services and telegraph offices and radio transmitters. They need border crossings and airports and harbors. Lisbon had it all. And Salazar, for his own reasons, let the game play out. Quite the great gathering. The transformation of Lisbon into a spy capital didn't happen overnight. It began in earnest after the fall of France in June 1940. Suddenly, Hitler controlled the entire Atlantic coast from Norway to Spain. Britain stood alone, and between occupied France and neutral Portugal, thousands of desperate people began to flee. Refugees poured into Lisbon throughout 1940 and 1941, Jews escaping the Holocaust, political dissidents fleeing the Gestapo, Allied soldiers evading capture, downed pilots trying to return to Britain, intellectuals and artists and ordinary families clutching exit visas and praying for ships to America. The city's population swelled. Hotels overflowed. The Portuguese government, overwhelmed, tightened restrictions but couldn't stop the flood. Among the refugees walked the spies. Because here's what made Lisbon perfect for espionage. In a city flooded with transients, strangers asking questions didn't stand out. A German agent could pose as a refugee. A British operative could pretend to be a fleeing businessman. An American intelligence officer could arrive as a journalist. Cover identities blended into the chaos, and the intelligence services knew it. They came in force. The British, MI6 and SOE set up shop. Britain's secret intelligence service, MI6, established a major station in Lisbon almost immediately. The station chief operated from the British embassy, but his agents spread throughout the city, renting apartments, cultivating sources, and monitoring German activities. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, Churchill's Organization for Sabotage and Subversion, also arrived, using Lisbon as a base to coordinate resistance movements in occupied Europe. British intelligence in Lisbon had several critical missions. First, gather intelligence on German U-boat movements. German submarines operated in the Atlantic, strangling British supply lines, and any information about their locations, refueling points or orders could save convoys. Second, track German espionage activities. Lisbon was crawling with Abwehr agents, German military intelligence, and the British needed to identify them, understand their operations, and if possible, turn them into double agents. Third, facilitate escape lines. MI9, the British Escape and Evasion Service, ran networks that smuggled downed pilots and escaped POWs through France, across the Pyrenees, through Spain, and into Portugal. From Lisbon, they could board ships home. Fourth, and this was crucial, conduct their own propaganda and deception operations, which we'll decode in detail shortly. British agents in Lisbon ranged from career intelligence officers to recruited locals. Portuguese citizens who opposed fascism, Anglophile aristocrats, hotel staff, taxi drivers, bartenders, all could be sources or assets. The British paid well in pound sterling that held value when other currencies collapsed. Information became currency. The Germans, Abwehr and SD in paradise. Germany's intelligence presence in Lisbon was equally formidable, but more divided. Two organizations competed, the Abwehr, led by the enigmatic Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, and the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the SS intelligence service under Reinhard Heydrich and later Walter Schellenberg. The Abwehr stationed dozens of agents in Portugal. Some operated under diplomatic cover at the German embassy. Others posed as businessmen involved in the tungsten trade. Portugal's mines produced tungsten that Germany desperately needed, providing perfect cover for industrial espionage. Still others ran networks of Portuguese informants who spied on British activities, monitored shipping, and reported on refugees who might be intelligence assets. German intelligence in Lisbon focused on several objectives: tracking Allied shipping and troop movements. Any information about convoys leaving Lisbon for Britain could help U-boats intercept them, recruiting agents to send to Britain or America. The Abwehr attempted to infiltrate spies into Allied countries, often using Portuguese nationals or refugees as cover, monitoring resistance activities. The SOE and other Allied services used Lisbon to communicate with underground movements in France, Belgium, and elsewhere. The Germans wanted to crack those networks: economic intelligence, understanding Allied resources, production, and supply chains could inform German strategy, and crucially, spreading disinformation, planting false intelligence that would mislead the Allies. But here's where it gets interesting. The Abwehr under Canaris was not entirely loyal to Hitler. Canaris himself had doubts about the Nazi regime, and some historians believe he quietly undermined certain operations. His agents in Lisbon sometimes played their own games, feeding the British information that wasn't entirely false but wasn't entirely helpful to Germany either. The SD, by contrast, was ruthlessly loyal to Himmler and the SS. They watched the Abwehr agents as much as they watched the British. In Lisbon, Germans spied on Allies, Allies spied on Germans, and Germans spied on other Germans. The complexity was maddening and perfect for a double agent. The Americans, late but eager. The United States entered the war in December 1941, and American intelligence arrived in Lisbon shortly after. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency and precursor to the CIA, established operations in Portugal throughout 1942 and 1943. American agents were often less experienced than their British or German counterparts, but they brought resources, money, technology, and enthusiasm. The OSS Lisbon station, led by capable officers, worked closely with the British, sharing information and coordinating operations. The Americans focused on different priorities, supporting resistance in occupied territories, particularly in France as preparations for D-Day began. Intelligence gathering on Axis powers, especially regarding technology, economics, and military capabilities, counter-espionage against German and Japanese agents, establishing rat lines, networks for moving agents, refugees and sensitive materials, and crucially, psychological warfare. The OSS ran propaganda operations from Lisbon, producing leaflets, radio broadcasts, and disinformation that targeted Axis-occupied populations. American agents also brought cutting-edge technology. Encrypted radio sets, microdot photography equipment, and sophisticated surveillance tools arrived in Lisbon, raising the stakes of the intelligence war. The others, Soviets, Japanese, and smaller players. Portugal's neutrality attracted everyone. Soviet intelligence operated in Lisbon, though more quietly. The NKVD, predecessor to the KGB, ran agents monitoring both Nazi and Allied activities, pursuing its own objectives in the broader geopolitical game. Stalin trusted neither side fully and wanted independent intelligence. Japanese intelligence maintained a presence through their embassy, focused primarily on Allied shipping and American activities in the Atlantic and Africa. Even smaller players appeared. Free French intelligence opposing Vichy collaborators, Polish intelligence in exile, Czech networks, Italian anti-fascists, and Spanish Republican spies fleeing Franco's regime. By 1942, Lisbon hosted the greatest concentration of intelligence operatives per square mile anywhere on Earth. Estimates suggest over 1,000 spies from various services operated in the city. Alongside countless informants, contacts, and support personnel, the game was on. And the rules were about to get very complicated. Hotels, where secrets were traded over cocktails. If Lisbon was the spy capital of WW2, then its hotels were the embassies of the Shadow War. Intelligence services didn't just use hotels for lodging. They transformed them into operational bases, meeting points, and hunting grounds. The most famous was the Hotel Aviz, located in central Lisbon. The Hotel Aviz was an elegant establishment that attracted the wealthy, the powerful, and the dangerous. Its bar became legendary among spies. On any given evening, you might find a German Abwehr officer drinking schnapps at one end, a British SOE agent sipping whiskey at the other, and an American OSS operative nursing gin in between, all watching each other through the mirror behind the bar. The hotel staff became unwitting, or sometimes witting, participants in espionage. Waiters memorized who met with whom. Chambermaids reported on luggage contents. Front desk clerks noted arrival and departure times. Some were paid informants for multiple services simultaneously, playing every side for profit. Room bugs were common. The PVDE, Portugal's security service, placed listening devices in select rooms, recording conversations that were then analyzed for intelligence value and potentially shared with whichever foreign service paid best or seemed most aligned with Portuguese interests at the moment. Other hotels served similar functions. The Hotel Palacio in Estoril, a coastal resort town near Lisbon, became a haven for exiled royalty and high-level operatives. The casino at Estoril provided another venue for clandestine meetings, where gambling losses could mask payments and chance encounters could be engineered. Ian Fleming, the British naval intelligence officer who would later create James Bond, visited Lisbon during the war and stayed at the Palacio. The casino, the intrigue, the beautiful spies, it all fed into his imagination. Casino Royale, his first Bond novel, drew directly from the atmosphere of wartime Estoril. But hotels weren't just for meetings. They were mailboxes. Dead drops were arranged in lobbies, bathrooms, or behind radiators. Secret correspondence was passed through hotel staff who acted as couriers. Codes were hidden in guest registries. Invisible ink messages were written on hotel stationery. The infrastructure of espionage required discretion, and hotels, staffed by professionals trained to ignore what they saw, provided it perfectly. Cafes and restaurants, the dining war. If hotels were embassies, cafes were neutral ground, public spaces where spies could observe without commitment, where contacts could be assessed before meetings, where information could be overheard. The Café Chiado, the Martinho da Arcada, a Brasileira. These establishments saw countless intelligence transactions. Agents developed their own routines, arriving at specific times, sitting at specific tables, ordering specific drinks as signals. One British agent reportedly used a simple system. If he ordered coffee, the meeting was safe. If he ordered tea, danger was present. If he ordered wine, aboard everything. His Portuguese contact, a waiter at a fashionable restaurant, adjusted his service based on these signals. Quick service meant proceed. Slow service meant wait. Bringing the wrong order meant leave immediately. Restaurants also facilitated social engineering. Intelligence officers would befriend diplomats, businessmen, or government officials over long dinners, gradually extracting information through conversation. Alcohol loosened tongues. Good food created goodwill. Attractive agents of both sexes used romance and seduction as tools, extracting secrets in exchange for affection, or the illusion of it. The Germans were particularly adept at this. Abwehr agents cultivated sources among Lisbon's social elite, attending parties, hosting dinners, and building relationships that yielded intelligence over time. One German operative, known only as Hans, reportedly ran a network of informants he recruited entirely through dinner parties at his rented villa, never once appearing at the German embassy. Communications, radio, couriers, and dead drops. Espionage requires communication, and Lisbon's infrastructure made it uniquely suitable. Portugal's neutrality meant Allied and Axis agents could send encrypted radio messages to their home countries without immediate interference, though the PVDE monitored everything. Radio stations operated from embassies, private residences, and even fishing boats anchored in the Tagus River. Encrypted messages flowed constantly. The British used one-time pads for absolute security. The Germans employed Enigma machines, unaware that Bletchley Park had cracked their codes. The Americans experimented with new encryption systems, but radio was risky. The PVDE had direction-finding equipment and could triangulate unauthorized transmitters. Agents caught broadcasting without permission faced arrest. though often they'd be released after a bribe or diplomatic pressure. Salazar's neutrality extended to pragmatism. If you're going to spy, at least be discreet about it. Couriers provided a more secure method. Intelligence officers used trusted individuals, diplomats with immunity, airline crew, merchant sailors, to physically carry documents, photographs, or microdots between Lisbon and other locations. The Pan American Clipper seaplanes that flew from Lisbon to New York became especially valuable, as their passengers and cargo weren't thoroughly searched. One famous courier was an aristocratic Portuguese woman. Let's call her Maria to protect her identity, though multiple women played similar roles, who traveled regularly between Lisbon and Madrid, London, and occasionally Switzerland. She carried documents sewn into her clothing, hidden in cosmetics cases, or memorized in code. She was paid by the British, suspected by the Germans, and monitored by the PVDE, but never caught because she played the role of frivolous socialite perfectly. No one suspected the woman obsessed with fashion shows was memorizing troop movements. Dead drops, hidden locations where materials could be left and retrieved without direct contact, were scattered across Lisbon. A hollow tree in a particular park, a loose brick in a specific wall, the underside of a bench in a church, behind books in a public library. These locations allowed agents to pass information without meeting, reducing the risk of surveillance catching both parties. The double-cross system's Portuguese connection. Now we reach the heart of our tale, where propaganda and espionage intertwined into something extraordinary. And nowhere was this more apparent than in Operation Fortitude and the double-cross system's use of Lisbon. The double-cross system, run by Britain's XX Committee, was one of the most successful counter-espionage operations in history. The British captured virtually every German spy sent to Britain, then turned them into double agents who fed false information back to Germany. But the system required a credible way to communicate with German intelligence, and Lisbon provided it. Several double agents operated through Lisbon or had handlers there. The most famous was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British. Garbo was a Spaniard who desperately wanted to fight fascism, but was rejected by British intelligence initially. So he created a fake spy network, pretended to be in London while actually in Lisbon, and fed false intelligence to the Germans based on library research and his vivid imagination. The Germans believed him completely. Eventually, the British realized what Garbo was doing, recruited him for real, and brought him to Britain. But his Lisbon connection remained crucial. Garbo communicated with his German handlers through letters, sent via Lisbon, using secret writing techniques, invisible ink made from chemicals that appeared only under specific treatments. He also used a radio operator supposedly based in Britain, but whose signals were managed from London. Through these communications routed via or referencing Lisbon, Garbo fed the Germans an elaborate deception. He invented a network of 27 imaginary sub-agents across Britain, each providing intelligence that was actually carefully crafted disinformation. Before D-Day, Garbo helped convince the Germans that the Normandy invasion was a feint, and the real attack would come at Pas de Calais. This deception saved thousands of Allied lives, and it all flowed through Lisbon's postal system, where German intelligence officers collected letters from their agent in London, never suspecting they were being played. Other double agents used similar Lisbon connections. Tricycle, Dusan Popov, a Yugoslav playboy recruited by the Germans and turned by the British, traveled regularly through Lisbon, meeting his Abwehr handlers there while actually working for MI6. He carried microdots, photographically reduced documents hidden under periods in typed letters that contained disinformation mixed with genuine but strategically useless intelligence to maintain credibility. Tricycle's Lisbon meetings were performances. He'd arrive with detailed reports, expense accounts, and requests for more money, playing the greedy spy perfectly while actually serving Allied interests. The Germans paid him handsomely, and he passed the funds to British intelligence, which used the money to run additional operations. The beauty of using Lisbon for these operations was deniability. If the Germans suspected deception, they couldn't easily verify. They couldn't send inspection teams to Britain. They couldn't interrogate sources directly. They had to trust their Agents and those agents were feeding them a steady diet of lies wrapped in just enough truth to taste authentic. Operation Mincemeat in Portuguese waters. One of the most audacious deception operations involving Portugal was Operation Mincemeat, immortalized in the film The Man Who Never Was. In April 1943, British intelligence wanted to deceive Germany about Allied invasion plans in the Mediterranean. The target was Sicily, but they wanted the Germans to expect Sardinia and Greece instead. So they concocted an incredible plan: plant false documents on a corpse, dump it in the ocean near Spain where it would wash ashore, and let the Spanish pass the documents to the Germans. The British obtained the body of a man who had died of pneumonia, which produces fluid in the lungs similar to drowning, dressed him as Major William Martin of the Royal Marines, and gave him a false identity complete with ticket stubs, love letters, and crucially, documents suggesting Allied invasion plans targeting Sardinia and Greece. The submarine HMS Seraph deposited the body off the coast of Huelva, Spain. Spanish authorities discovered it, and just as British intelligence hoped, Spanish intelligence shared the documents with the Germans. But here's where Portugal comes in. The operation's success depended on German intelligence in the Iberian Peninsula, believing the documents were genuine. The Abwehr station in Lisbon was consulted, and agents there were asked to verify details about British military movements, personnel, and plans that might corroborate or contradict the Major Martin documents. The Lisbon station, analyzing their own intelligence from sources around Portugal and Spain, found nothing that contradicted the deception, because British intelligence had carefully ensured consistency across all their operations. They'd planted corroborating rumors, adjusted genuine activities to match the false narrative, and even allowed some true information to leak that supported the overall deception. German intelligence in Lisbon sent assessments back to Berlin, recommending the documents be taken seriously. Hitler himself was convinced, and German reinforcements were sent to Sardinia and Greece while Sicily's defenses were weakened. Operation Mincemeat succeeded largely because the intelligence analysis done in neutral Portugal confirmed the deception. The spies walking Lisbon's streets, gathering information from ports and businesses and casual conversations, unknowingly contributed to one of the war's greatest tricks: black propaganda, the radio wars. Propaganda and espionage merged most directly. In black propaganda operations, psychological warfare disguised to appear as enemy communications, and Lisbon played a role here too. The British operated several black radio stations that pretended to be German broadcasts. These stations, run by the political warfare executive, claimed to be clandestine German resistance stations or rogue Wehrmacht units, but were actually broadcasting from Britain. They spread defeatism, confusion, and disinformation among German audiences. But to make these broadcasts believable, they needed intelligence about Germany, local details, current grievances, military slang, and cultural references that would convince listeners the broadcasts were genuine. Much of this intelligence came from sources in Lisbon: German refugees who'd fled to Portugal, prisoners of war being transported through, businessmen who'd recently left Germany, and yes, spies who gathered information specifically for propaganda use. One British operative in Lisbon spent his time interviewing German émigrés in cafes, ostensibly writing a book about their experiences. In reality, he was collecting material for black propaganda scripts. The stories these refugees told about food shortages, about harsh Nazi policies, about fear and suffering, were incorporated into broadcasts designed to undermine German morale. The Americans ran similar operations. The OSS produced counterfeit German newspapers that contained real news mixed with defeatist articles, suggesting internal dissent and military failures. These papers were smuggled into occupied Europe through networks coordinated from Lisbon. The content was carefully calibrated, too obviously false and readers would dismiss it. Too subtle, and it wouldn't have psychological impact. Intelligence from Lisbon helped strike that balance. The reverse happened too. German intelligence produced black propaganda targeting Allied audiences, and some of it was coordinated from Lisbon. Fake resistance newsletters, Forged Allied documents and disinformation about military setbacks were created to demoralize or mislead. The result was a hall of mirrors. Real intelligence gathering enabled fake propaganda, which in turn generated real psychological effects which created new intelligence targets. Everything connected. The Battle of the Posters. Visual propaganda with hidden layers. Visual propaganda in Portugal was subtle but significant. As a neutral country, Portugal couldn't allow overtly pro-Allied or pro-Axis messaging, but that didn't stop the intelligence services from trying. British and American embassies produced informational posters and leaflets about the war that were carefully designed to appear neutral while subtly favoring the Allied perspective. These materials were distributed to Portuguese newspapers, businesses, and cultural centers. They contained factual information about military progress, economic conditions, and political developments, all technically true, but framed to make the Allies look competent and the Axis look faltering. Some of these materials contained hidden messages, not crude codes, but visual and textual elements that conveyed information to trained observers. An intelligence officer might include specific photographs that, to an asset who'd been briefed, indicated operational status. A seemingly innocent article about shipping might contain details that told a handler an agent was compromised or successful. One technique involved using agreed-upon keywords in public materials. A British-produced newsletter about the war might describe a battle as decisive, a term that meant nothing to general readers, but told a specific agent in Spain that funds had been deposited in a specified account. Or an article might mention a Tuesday meeting of diplomats, which signaled to a network that a dead drop would be serviced on Tuesday. The Germans did the same. Abwehr officers arranged for pro-German articles in Portuguese newspapers that contained coded phrases. A seemingly neutral piece about German industrial capacity might include numbers that, to the trained eye, were actually coordinates or dates for operations. This intersection of public propaganda and secret communication exemplifies the Lisbon espionage environment. Nothing was entirely what it seemed, and everything could serve multiple purposes. The double agents. Playing all sides. Lisbon's greatest asset to intelligence services was its people, Portuguese and foreign, principled and mercenary, brave and treacherous. The double agents who emerged from this environment were some of the war's most remarkable figures. We've mentioned Tricycle, Dusan Popov, but his story deserves deeper examination. Popov was a wealthy Yugoslav who enjoyed the high life, gambling, women, luxury. The Germans recruited him in 1940. Believing his lifestyle and connections made him perfect for espionage, they sent him to Britain to gather intelligence. Instead, Popov immediately contacted British intelligence and offered to become a double agent. The British, after vetting him, agreed. Popov would pretend to spy for Germany while actually working for Britain. His Lisbon meetings with German handlers were legendary. He'd arrive at Esteril's casino in expensive suits, surrounded by beautiful women living exactly the life his handlers expected. He'd gamble heavily, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, creating a pattern that matched his cover as a playboy who needed money. Then in between gambling sessions, he'd meet his Abwehr case officer in a quiet corner of the hotel, passing information that the British had carefully prepared. The intelligence Popov provided was real enough to keep the Germans trusting him, but useless for actual operations. Or it was disinformation designed to mislead, and in exchange, Popov learned what the Germans wanted to know, which itself was intelligence. That told the British what German strategy might be. Popov had a close call in Lisbon in 1941. An Abwehr officer suspected he might be doubled and arranged a test. Popov was given a specific task that could only be completed if he genuinely had access in Britain. Popov realized the trap, and British intelligence frantically arranged to fulfill the task just enough to satisfy German suspicions without compromising security. The knife-edge nature of double agent work couldn't be clearer. Another remarkable double agent connected to Lisbon was Treasure, Natalie Lily Sergeyu, a French woman recruited by the Germans who turned herself in to British intelligence. She operated primarily from Britain, but communicated with the Germans via Lisbon connections. Her motivation was complex. She hated the Nazis for occupying France, but she also had a German handler she'd become fond of. creating emotional turmoil that nearly compromised operations. Treasure's most dramatic moment came when her beloved dog, which the British had promised to bring from France, died in quarantine due to British bureaucratic negligence. Heartbroken and furious, she considered defecting back to the Germans. Only careful psychological management by her British handlers kept her loyal, and she continued feeding disinformation that contributed to D-Day deceptions. These weren't comic book heroes or villains. They were complicated people navigating impossible situations, where loyalty was currency and survival required constant performance. The Portuguese, walking both sides of the street. Portugal's own citizens became key players. Some worked for foreign intelligence services for ideological reasons, anti-fascists who helped the Allies, fascist sympathizers who aided Germany. Others did it for money, selling information to whoever paid best, sometimes multiple services simultaneously. Portuguese businessmen involved in the tungsten trade were particularly valuable. Tungsten from Portuguese mines was critical for Germany's war machine, and both Britain and Germany competed to buy it, or to stop the other from buying it. Intelligence officers cultivated sources among mine owners, shipping companies, and government trade officials to track tungsten flows and, when possible, to sabotage shipments. One Portuguese mine owner reportedly played an extraordinarily dangerous game. He'd sell tungsten to Germany as required by his contracts, but he'd tip off British intelligence about shipment schedules, allowing the Royal Navy to accidentally sink the ships. He'd then claim force majeure on his German contracts, sell the next batch to Britain at inflated prices, and pocket profits from both sides while ensuring less tungsten reached Germany overall. If this story is true, and some details remain classified, the man was either a genius or insane. Probably both. Portuguese aristocrats also played roles. Some hosted salons where diplomats and intelligence officers from all nations mingled, creating opportunities for recruitment or information gathering. A countess with connections to both British and German high society might overhear at a dinner party that a specific German officer was being transferred. Innocuous gossip that, passed to British intelligence, helped track German command structures. Even Portuguese government officials walked both sides. The PVDE collaborated with British intelligence on some matters while cooperating with German intelligence on others, all under Salazar's implicit approval. Information was bartered. The British might share intelligence about communist activities, which Salazar feared, in exchange for the PVDE looking the other way when British agents violated Portuguese law. The Germans might share information about Allied agents in exchange for the PVDE ignoring German smuggling operations. This web of compromises and betrayals made Lisbon function. Everyone was complicit. Everyone benefited. And everyone understood that the game could only continue as long as Portugal remained neutral. The refugees. Cover and chaos. The tens of thousands of refugees flooding into Portugal created both cover and complications for intelligence operations. Among the desperate masses fleeing Nazi persecution were hidden operatives on both sides. Allied intelligence services smuggled agents into neutral territory by disguising them as refugees. A trained saboteur might arrive with forged papers claiming to be a Jewish family fleeing Belgium, blending into the genuine refugee population. Once in Lisbon, they'd shed their cover and begin operations. The chaos made verification nearly impossible. Even the PVDE, with its extensive files, couldn't background check every arrival. Conversely, German intelligence inserted agents among refugees, particularly targeting refugee organizations that helped evacuees reach America or Palestine. A German spy posing as a desperate refugee might infiltrate these networks to gather intelligence about Allied personnel, identify potential recruits, or even sabotage escape operations. The human cost was real. Genuine refugees suffered delays when security services suspected them of being spies. Families were separated when one member's documentation raised flags. People died waiting for exit. Visas that never came because some bureaucrat suspected, rightly or wrongly, that they were intelligence assets. One heartbreaking case involved a Polish-Jewish family that reached Lisbon in late 1941. They had everything they needed: visas to America, ship tickets, documentation, but British intelligence suspected, incorrectly, that the father was a German plant because his escape from Poland had been too easy. The family was detained for weeks while MI6 investigated. By the time they were cleared, their ship had sailed, their visas had expired, and they couldn't get new ones because American quotas were filled. They survived the war in Portugal, but barely. Others weren't so fortunate. Delayed refugees who ended up deported back to Vichy France or Spain often faced eventual capture by the Gestapo.
The intersection of espionage and humanitarian crisis in Lisbon remains one of the war's most morally complicated chapters. Intelligence services needed to maintain security, but innocent people paid the price. The femme fatales and seductresses, reality versus myth. No discussion of World War II espionage is complete without addressing the role of women as intelligence operatives and separating fact from Hollywood fiction. Yes, women worked as spies in Lisbon. Yes, some used seduction as a tool, but the reality was far more complex than the femme fatale stereotype suggests. Many female operatives were highly trained intelligence professionals who used their gender as operational advantage, not through seduction, but because male targets underestimated them. A woman could ask questions in social settings that a man couldn't without arousing suspicion. She could observe military movements while appearing to shop or take walks. She could cultivate sources among secretaries, maids, and other women with access to sensitive information, networks that male officers ignored. One British operative in Lisbon, we'll call her Elizabeth, worked as a secretary at a shipping company while actually being a trained MI6 officer. Her job gave her access to cargo manifests, shipping schedules, and client lists. She identified which Portuguese shipping companies were moving supplies to Germany, which were neutral, and which might be persuaded to lose cargo destined for the Third Reich. Her intelligence helped the Royal Navy prioritize targets and guided British economic warfare efforts. Elizabeth's work was unglamorous. Filing, typing, mildly flirting with her boss to stay in his good graces, memorizing documents, and passing information through dead drops. She never seduced anyone, never carried a gun, never had dramatic confrontations, but her contributions were invaluable. That said, sexual entrapment did occur. The Germans operated at least one salon in Lisbon, run by a German woman with Abwehr connections, where attractive female hostesses would befriend Allied officers, diplomats, and businessmen. After drinks and flirtation, these men might let slip information about troop movements, supply issues, or political tensions. Sometimes the women would engineer compromising situations, sexual affairs that could be used for blackmail. The British ran similar operations, though they're less documented. One reported case involved a British asset cultivating a relationship with a German diplomat's aide, slowly building trust over months until the aide, desperate for validation and affection, began sharing information about diplomatic communications between Berlin and the Lisbon embassy. These operations were morally murky. The women involved, whether volunteers or coerced, occupied positions of extreme vulnerability. If exposed, they faced potential execution, imprisonment, or social destruction. Their agency varied. Some were committed anti-fascists who saw seduction as warfare by other means. Others were desperate refugees who traded intimacy for safety or money. Still others were professional intelligence officers doing unpleasant but necessary work. The historical record struggles with these women. Many have no names in archives, labeled only as source or asset. Their stories deserve remembering, not glamorized, but honored for their complexity. 1943-1944. The Axis loses ground. By 1943,
The balance of espionage in Lisbon began shifting decisively toward the Allies. The tide of war itself changed. Stalingrad fell to the Soviets, North Africa was secured by the Allies, and Italy began to collapse. As German military fortunes declined, so did the effectiveness of their intelligence operations. German agents in Lisbon found their sources drying up. Portuguese officials who'd been friendly when Germany seemed likely to win Europe became suddenly unavailable for meetings. Businessmen who'd traded with the Reich discovered they could get better prices from the Allies. Even the PVDE became less cooperative, as Salazar quietly recalibrated his neutrality toward the likely victors. The Abwehr faced internal crises, too. Admiral Canaris's doubts about Hitler had grown, and his organization was increasingly undermined by the SS and the SD. In February 1944, the Abwehr was absorbed into the SD entirely, and Canaris himself was eventually arrested and executed for his connection to the July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. The Lisbon Abwehr station fell into chaos during this transition. Agents didn't know whom to report to, which operations were still authorized, or even who was loyal to whom. British intelligence in Lisbon exploited this confusion ruthlessly, turning several German agents during this period by offering them better options than an increasingly doomed Reich. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence in Lisbon expanded. American OSS personnel flooded in as preparations for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, intensified. The British used their Lisbon station to coordinate massive deception operations. Double agents fed the Germans a steady stream of disinformation through Lisbon channels, all building toward the greatest deception, convincing Germany that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The espionage and economic warfare merged into a single operation that weakened Germany's war machine without firing a shot.
D-Day and after. Lisbon's purpose evolved. When Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Lisbon's importance began to shift. The successful invasion meant the liberation of Western Europe had begun. As France was freed, alternative routes for communications, logistics, and operations opened up. Lisbon was no longer the only gateway between occupied Europe and the free world. But the intelligence war in Lisbon didn't end. It evolved. Allied intelligence services used Lisbon increasingly for counterintelligence operations targeting Soviet espionage. As the war's end became visible, tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union began emerging. Portugal became a venue for monitoring Soviet activities, identifying Soviet agents, and conducting operations that prepared for the Cold War that everyone could see coming. Soviet intelligence had maintained a relatively low profile in Lisbon compared to other services, but by late 1944 and early 1945, their presence expanded. The NKVD ran operations, gathering intelligence on both German capabilities, useful for the Eastern Front, and Allied intentions, useful for post-war positioning. British and American counterintelligence began tracking Soviet operatives, recruiting sources within Soviet networks, and laying the groundwork for what would become decades of espionage rivalry.
German intelligence in Lisbon essentially collapsed by early 1945. With the Reich itself under attack from both east and west, there were no resources for Lisbon operations. Some German agents defected, offering their services to the Allies in exchange for protection from war crimes prosecution. Others fled to South America using the same escape routes they'd once monitored. A few continued futile operations until Germany's surrender in May 1945, filing reports that no one in Berlin was alive to read. The end of the game, when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Lisbon's role as spy capital ended almost overnight. The city that had hosted thousands of operatives, informants, and contacts suddenly found itself irrelevant to the main action. Intelligence services began closing stations or dramatically reducing them. The British retained a presence for counter-Soviet work. The Americans did likewise. But the massive operations, the Baroque networks, the daily drama of competing espionage, all of it wound down within months. The hotels returned to normal hospitality. The cafes served ordinary customers instead of conspiring spies. The PVDE continued monitoring dissidents, but the excitement of playing all sides against each other was gone. Lisbon became once again a sleepy European capital on the Atlantic edge. Many of the spies simply disappeared. Some returned home to resume civilian lives. Their wartime activities classified secrets they'd carry to their graves. Others transitioned into the emerging Cold War intelligence services, taking their tradecraft from Lisbon to Berlin, Vienna, and other new battlegrounds. A few stayed in Portugal, finding they'd grown fond of the place and lived out their lives quietly, their past lives known only to themselves and their former handlers. The refugees, too, dispersed. Tens of thousands moved on to America, Britain, Palestine, or wherever their exit visas allowed. Some stayed in Portugal, building new lives in a country that had offered them refuge, however grudging and complicated, when the rest of Europe had become a killing field. By 1946, you could walk through the Rossio Square or sit in the Hotel Aviz bar and see no trace of what had occurred there. The shadows had lifted, the games had ended, the players had moved on, but the secrets remained, the nature of neutrality. Lisbon's experience as a World War II espionage hub teaches us profound lessons about neutrality, power and survival in a world at war. Salazar's Portugal demonstrates that neutrality is never truly neutral. It's a negotiated position that requires constant recalibration, compromise, and yes, cynicism. Portugal survived the war intact, not because it remained pure and uninvolved, but because it involved itself with everyone, playing sides against each other, extracting benefits, and providing just enough value to each party that none found it worthwhile to invade. This wasn't moral neutrality. Portugal's authoritarian regime had more in common with the Axis powers ideologically, and Salazar admired aspects of fascism even as he kept Hitler at arm's length. But it was effective neutrality, pragmatic, calculated, and ultimately successful in preserving Portuguese independence and avoiding the devastation that consumed the rest of Europe. The lesson resonates beyond World War II. How do smaller nations navigate great power conflicts? By providing value to all sides. Switzerland, Sweden, Ireland, and Turkey employed similar strategies during the war, though none hosted quite the espionage concentration that Lisbon did. Today, nations like Singapore, the UAE, or various Latin American countries navigate U.S.-China tensions using analogous approaches, maintaining relationships with both sides, hosting both sides' interests, and extracting benefits from strategic positioning. Lisbon shows us that neutrality is an active stance, not a passive withdrawal. It requires intelligence services monitoring everyone, diplomatic skill managing everyone, and a willingness to accept moral ambiguity as the price of survival. The intelligence lessons. What the spies learned. The espionage operations conducted in Lisbon refined techniques that shaped Cold War intelligence work and remain relevant today. First, the double-cross operations run through Lisbon proved that strategic deception could achieve what military force alone could not. The D-Day deceptions routed through Lisbon's double agents saved thousands of lives by misdirecting German defenders. Modern intelligence services still use deception operations, from cyber false flags to disinformation campaigns, applying principles that were perfected in wartime Portugal. Second, Lisbon demonstrated the importance of neutral ground in intelligence work. Espionage requires places where adversaries can operate without immediately triggering military confrontation. During the Cold War, Vienna, Geneva, and even Mexico City served similar functions. Cities where CIA and KGB officers could recruit sources, conduct operations, and occasionally even negotiate through back channels. Today, certain cities in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe serve analogous roles in intelligence operations between various services. Third, the integration of propaganda and espionage that occurred in Lisbon presaged modern information warfare. The realization that public messaging could mask secret communications, that fake news could serve intelligence objectives, and that psychological operations required intelligence gathering. These insights matured in Lisbon and became foundational to Cold War and contemporary intelligence work. Fourth, human intelligence proved irreplaceable. Despite technological advances during WW2, from Enigma machines to radar, the most valuable intelligence in Lisbon came from people, double agents, informants, sources cultivated over months of relationship building. Today, despite signals intelligence and cyber capabilities, human sources remain critical. The techniques used in Lisbon, recruitment based on ideology or money, managing double agents, vetting sources, are still taught at intelligence training facilities worldwide. The human cost, remembering the forgotten. For all its intrigue and strategic significance, we must remember that Lisbon's spy war had real human costs, even if they were less visible than battlefield casualties. Double agents lived under constant psychological pressure, never fully trusted by either side, aware that discovery meant execution. Several did break under the strain. Some were executed by the Germans when suspicions arose. Others suffered mental health crises that ended their operations. Refugees caught in security screenings suffered delays that sometimes proved fatal. Families were separated when one member was detained on suspicion of being a spy. Children grew up in refugee camps or temporary housing, their parents unable to move forward because intelligence services flagged them for investigation. Portuguese citizens who worked for foreign intelligence services faced dangers too. After the war, some were prosecuted by the PVDE for violations of Portuguese neutrality. Others found themselves targeted by former employers or enemies, their cooperation during the war remembered by people with long memories and short tempers. The women who served as intelligence assets, whether through seduction operations or other roles, often found their contributions forgotten or deliberately obscured in post-war records. Their work was classified, their sacrifices unrecorded, their names erased. Many died without recognition, their families never knowing what they'd done. Even the successful agents faced difficult transitions. After living under cover identities, constantly performing, never fully trusted, many struggled with peacetime normalcy. Some became intelligence professionals long-term, unable to return to civilian life. Others struggled with what we'd now recognize as PTSD, though the term didn't exist then and support wasn't available. Lisbon's espionage legacy is fascinating, strategically important and historically significant, but it was also, for the people who lived it, exhausting, dangerous, and often traumatic. We should remember both aspects. The unresolved mysteries. Despite decades of declassification and historical research, mysteries from Lisbon's WW2 espionage remain unsolved. Who was the highest-ranking Portuguese official working for a foreign intelligence service? Multiple sources suggest someone in Salazar's inner circle provided intelligence to the British, but the person's identity has never been confirmed. Was it a government minister? A PVDE commander? Someone even closer to Salazar himself? The secret, if it exists, remains locked in classified archives.
What happened to the significant amounts of money that flowed through Lisbon during intelligence operations? Millions of pounds, marks, dollars, and escudos changed hands. Payments to agents, bribes to officials, operational funds. Much of it disappeared into accounts that were never fully audited after the war. Did corrupt officials enrich themselves? Did agents skim operational funds? Or was it simply that record-keeping during wartime was chaotic and imprecise? How many people actually died as a direct result of espionage operations in Portugal? The country was neutral, so official combat deaths were minimal. But intelligence operations can be lethal. Murders disguised as accidents, prisoners who disappeared, agents who were quietly eliminated. Reliable numbers don't exist. Some estimates suggest dozens, others hundreds. The truth likely lies somewhere between, but we may never know precisely. What secrets remain classified? Even 80 years later, not all intelligence files from WW2 have been declassified. British, American, German, and Russian archives still hold documents about Lisbon operations that remain restricted. What do they contain? embarrassing revelations about cooperation with war criminals, techniques still considered sensitive, information about sources whose descendants could still be endangered. Until archives are fully opened, speculation continues. The final reveal. So we return to our original question. How did neutral Portugal become the hub of WW2 espionage? The answer, as we've decoded, reveals a perfect convergence of geography, politics, timing, and human nature. Geography placed Portugal at the crossroads of the Atlantic world, between occupied Europe and the free nations beyond, making it strategically vital for communications, logistics, and escape routes. Politics gave Portugal a dictator skilled enough to maintain neutrality through careful balance, ruthless enough to suppress internal opposition, and cynical enough to allow espionage that served his interests. Timing meant that Portugal's neutrality became most valuable exactly when Europe's war was most intense, from 1940's fall of France through 1944's D-Day invasion, creating a 4-year window of maximum espionage activity. And human nature ensured that where there were high stakes, vulnerable people, scarce resources, and competing interests, intelligence services would gather like predators around prey. The intersection of propaganda and espionage in Lisbon reveals something profound about modern warfare. Wars are fought not just with guns and bombs, but with information, perception, and deception. The intelligence operations conducted from Lisbon, the double agents feeding disinformation, the propaganda operations shaping perceptions, the economic warfare over tungsten, the escape network saving lives. These contributed as much to Allied victory as many military campaigns. In Lisbon, paper was as powerful as explosives. A forged document changed history as surely as a tank offensive. A turned agent altered the war's course as significantly as a general's battlefield decision. The city proved that in modern war, everyone is on the front lines, even those in supposedly neutral territory. The Cipher Tales perspective. Here at Cipher Tales, we decode the hidden intersections of WW2 propaganda and espionage because these stories reveal eternal truths about power, deception, and survival. Lisbon's tale isn't just historical curiosity, it's a masterclass in information warfare, a case study in neutral survival, and a reminder that the most important battles are often invisible. The spies who walked Lisbon's streets, met in its hotels, and whispered in its cafes were writing invisible chapters of history. Every double-crossed agent, every intercepted message, every turned source altered the war's trajectory in ways that only became clear years later, when archives opened and survivors finally spoke. We've decoded how a small, neutral nation became the world's greatest espionage hub, how propaganda masked operations, and operations generated propaganda, how individual spies' decisions rippled across continents, and how the desperate refugees fleeing Hitler's Europe unknowingly provided cover for the intelligence war that would help him defeat him. But we've only begun to scratch the surface. Lisbon's streets hold countless more stories, individual agents whose operations remain classified, networks whose full scope has never been revealed, betrayals and triumphs that changed specific lives, even if they didn't alter history's grand arc. The invitation. This is what Cipher Tales does. We decode the forgotten, reveal the hidden, and illuminate the shadows where propaganda and espionage intersect. If you've stayed with us for this entire journey through wartime Lisbon, you understand that history is richer, stranger, and more complex than simplified narratives suggest. There are so many more tales to decode. The cartoons that hid operational signals, the double agents who changed D-Day, the propaganda posters with coded messages, the neutral countries that weren't as neutral as they claimed, the artists who moonlighted as spies, the radio broadcasts that rewrote reality. Every week, we decode another intersection of WW2 propaganda and espionage, revealing how information warfare shaped the modern world and continues shaping it today. If this deep dive into how neutral Portugal became WW2's espionage hub fascinated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for weekly decoded mysteries from the hidden history of WW2. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Like this video if you found it engaging, informative, or eye-opening. Every like tells the algorithm that deep historical content matters, helping us reach more people who love this intersection of history and espionage. Comment below and tell us, what aspect of Lisbon's spy war surprised you most? Should we decode specific agent stories in future videos? Are there other neutral territories from WW2 you want us to investigate? Your comments guide our research and help us create the content you want. Share this video with anyone fascinated by WW2 history, espionage, or the hidden stories that changed our world. These tales deserve to be known. Next week on Cipher Tales, we're decoding another forgotten chapter, the cartoon that exposed a Nazi spy network. You won't believe how animated propaganda became an intelligence weapon. Until then, remember, history's greatest secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be decoded. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering.